Hey, welcome back to the Tony Kinnett cast here on the Daily Signal, now nationally syndicated and first on 93 WIBC. We're thrilled to be joined again by the one, the only Andy Ngo, whose work on exposing Antifa is just incredible. It's fearless, and it has been acutely summarized, I would say, in his book Unmasked. You definitely want to check this one out. This is one I was excited to add to the shelf. Let's just say that it is well worth your time. Andy, thanks for hopping on with us.
Thanks for having me on. Actually, the book came out in 2021, but the reason why it seems new in the minds of many, and I appreciate that plug, is because unfortunately the topic is evergreen in the American political context.
Well, it's definitely new to add to my shelf. I don't know why it wasn't on there already, but it is now. So, very, very well suited among some of my other recent favorites. So, you have a new report coming out from Portland that Antifa ringleader Alissa Azar has been sentenced to jail by a county judge following a felony jury conviction last month. So, not just a little misdemeanor situation. First of all, can you go into detail about what she was sentenced for before we dig into the rest of the meat and potatoes of this situation?
So the case is significant because Ms. Azar plays, according to prosecutor, a ringleader type role in her involvement in a violent riot in June 2021 in Clackamas County, which is the neighboring moderate county to Multnomah County, where Portland is. I'm originally from Portland. Most of my reporting is about Portland. I was there on the ground during years of riots. And one thing that people who listen to me read my work know is that most of the time, in fact, almost always, the riot suspects are not held accountable. There's a number of reasons for that. There's the political culture of Portland. There's also the district attorney. There's also so on and so forth. I can go on.
Yeah. Just actors upon actors willing to go to bat for them or ignore their shenanigans.
So this has created a culture where far-left violent extremists feel like they can engage in acts of criminality, violent criminality, arson attacks, assault with impunity. And unfortunately, usually they can do those acts with impunity. But in June of 2021, Alissa Azar and her comrades dressed in black went to Clackamas County and engaged in a violent brawl with associated Proud Boys members and other people that they accused of being far right. People in the park were victimized. This is a summer day where people brought their children and families to the park, and they were subjected to this barrage of pepper spray during the trial that happened. The 5-day trial that happened in August. My great colleague Katie Davis Court was there throughout the entire trial.
Much to the dismay of the Antifa individuals who I think tried to get the post-millennial crew thrown out because simply covering the event was, what did they say, inciting violence towards the violent provocateur?
Repeatedly. So you bring up another issue. I'll get to that in just a sec.
Sorry, I can't. This whole situation is just bonkers.
To sum up the case, law enforcement testimony provided from Oregon City Police said that they recovered explosive devices there. So really serious stuff. It's not just people going to a park and fighting. Alissa Azar was indicted a number of years ago. There have been other Proud Boy members alleged who have been indicted as well, and they have their cases pending. So the significance of Ms. Azar's case is that she has a very large social media following. She's become, in my view, the chief propagandist for Antifa in the Portland area.
I think that's accurate.
And the fact that, to my knowledge, she remains the first and the only Antifa member in the entire state of Oregon who has been convicted at trial. So I'll repeat that. Nobody else in all these other years of rioting, thousands of cases by now, none of them have been convicted at trial. The few that were convicted in Portland for very serious crimes like attempted murder and other serious assaults, they took sweetheart plea deals, usually did not do prison time. And so this case has angered Antifa in the Pacific Northwest because they felt like they'd been able to do their crimes with impunity. Azar burst into tears when the verdict was read out. By the way, the jury was made up of mostly women, and the defense had a number of tactics. They were trying to argue that she's a journalist. She's not. that she was engaging in self-defense. She wasn't. They try to argue that she's a helpless small woman who was attacked by violent far-right men. The jury of females in Oregon did not buy it, and they convicted her.
So I do want to actually make sure that if you're watching the live stream on X or YouTube, you actually get a look at this. Those who are on the podcast, here's what it sounds like. Check this out.
The trial was last month in August, and sentencing finally happened last week. Unfortunately, in the state of Oregon, it's a state run by Democrats, and the legislation that they passed over the years has moved in a direction where criminal convicts are not serving much time, if at all, in prison.
Oh, what a
even
surprise.
when they're convicted. So the most that Miss Azar was looking at, the maximum she was looking at, was 30 days in a local jail, not prison, local jail. And that's what the prosecutors asked for in addition to probation. They also asked for GPS monitoring. Her defense, she's been represented pro bono, as far as I know, by a far left activist attorney, part of a really radical far left group called the Civil Liberties Defense Center. What a name. Misleading name. They represent violent Antifa suspects. And the defense argued that she shouldn't serve any time in jail, and that sending her to jail is racist, sexist, all these type of buzzwords. The judge didn't buy much of what the defense was saying. The defense also tried to get my colleague, Katie Davis-Core, and our photographer, Shelly Bufarash, thrown out of the court, alleging that our reporting had incited death threats against Azar and her family.
I love the idea of throwing out the photographer as well, as though like the pictures taken themselves are somehow going to be used to incite death threats or whatever. I'm glad the judge threw that nonsense out, because the post-millennial crew has just an excellent staff, as you've already said, of which you work with consistently, an excellent staff of both reporters and photographers.
Well, it's part of the MO to try to kick press out, particularly press who are reporting honestly about these trials that involve Antifa members, because a lot of the evidence will go under the radar at trial. And in addition, the public won't get the true understanding that so much of their activities and organizing is masked behind secrecy. And literally, you could see that in the dozens of people who came to support Azar, both at the trial and at the sentencing, were wearing masks, sunglasses, head coverings. And unfortunately, that's allowed because of changes from the pandemic that allow people to hide their identities, even in a courtroom setting. And so Azar was sentenced to just 14 days in jail. The judge gave about half of what the prosecution was asking for. And she won't even serve the full 14 days. She's scheduled to be released after 11, and it's likely she'll probably be released earlier than that.
That's just insane.
But in Oregon, this is really the most punishment that a Antifa member can really face. Unfortunately for Ms. Azar, and maybe fortunately for the rule of law, this is not the end of her legal woes, in that in Multnomah County in May, she was arrested out of pretty violent Portland state occupation when there were these encampments going on for Gaza. So that
Antifa occupation getting violent? No, now. What a surprise.
Exactly. So that criminal case is still ongoing for her in Multnomah County. And now that she's a convicted felon, any future convictions, the sentencing guidelines for that will be different. It will be more severe.
That's one of the reasons that's such a significant thing. Once you're slapped with that felony in that particular category, in most states in the country, future sentencing gets more severe. Because if you're charged and convicted of a felony in domestic abuse, let's say, and then later on you're dragged in again for domestic abuse, not only does that often kick up even some misdemeanors into a felony, but that also means you can't get the 11-day prison sentence or the 11-day jail sentence, which is just ridiculous. I mean, that's like the community service of jail sentences. But we only have a few minutes here left, actually. We're running a little bit short on time. I had two questions that were sent in that asked kind of the same thing when it was found that you were coming on the show. I can't help but advertise whenever you're stopping by because, especially after my reporting in Chicago, so many people are just itching to see the reporting from you, from Julio Rosas, of course, and then yours truly when I was in Chicago with the DNC from inside these riots. The question that was asked is about this theoretical leash. We know that Iran has been pumping a lot of money into the pro-Palestinian protests. And we know that groups like George Soros have been pumping money into at least the legal defense, if not the elections of those who are going to be more lenient on the kind of radical socialist and Marxist groups. Is there anyone that's holding a leash from keeping these groups from getting violent at all? We often talk about these things spiraling out of control, but I was asked twice over the last 2 weeks, do you think that after your years of working in exposing this kind of stuff, of course, as you've outlined in your book, Unmasked, with a few new updates, is there any group or entity out there that you believe is holding the leash to give proper direction, or is this kind of a emotionalism on the ground that often spirals out of control?
So this is probably the most common question I ask is there some type of organizational structure top down to Antifa movements?
Oh,
or
sorry, I
groups
didn't mean to
generally?
ask you a milquetoast common question. I just we just got a couple of questions for me
No,
to ask you
it's
specifically.
important because and I'm glad I answered every time. There's no single person or a group of people that I've been able to identify through any evidence who's holding a leash in this type of regard. And the same in regards to the funding.
That's both
Ever
good and
s-
bad.
Ever since the 60s and 70s, when far left revolutionary communist terrorists in America their cells were broken up, like in the Weather Underground, they were convicted, they were on the FBI's most wanted, spent many years in prison.
Right.
The far left organizing in the United States and the West generally has moved away from sort of those formalized terror groups into these decentralized, self-radicalized individuals. And some of them do cluster into a sort of uh, cell. And I describe some groups in that way, in like Rose City Antifa, which does have a website.
But that's
and
more
social
born
media
out of
handles.
social media grouping rather than specific leadership identitarianism.
Well, the way that Antifa organizes that it's radically horizontal and autonomous, and they do that intentionally so that the movement is very, very difficult to disrupt. One person is arrested, one person is convicted. You're not able to really damage the networks. However, there are some developments have happened. It wasn't This year has seen actually a number of Antifa convictions. In addition to Miss Azar, earlier this year, I did a lot of reporting out of San Diego County, where 12 members were ultimately convicted. 12 members of SoCal Antifa, that was the name of their cluster of cells in San Diego. They were convicted. All of them were given jail time, and so that case also really, again, there wasn't much legacy media there, but the evidence that came out from what the prosecution was able to retrieve from signal chats and private communications they had amongst one another, that they, at least in some of these cells, they are highly organized. But in terms of at a higher level, there's not evidence that I've been able to find that shows any type of hierarchical structure
So
where you could topple the top and then the thing falls apart. It doesn't work like that.
I say that's good and bad for one primary reason. So that it's good because that means that in and of itself, this is born out of kind of a cultural consciousness and is therefore fragile, as in there's not one group that's one individual, one entity that's coordinating things in more of a massive structure to do directed, pre-planned harm. Now, obviously, as you and I have seen, we've both looked at undercover group signal chats, Telegram chats, different things that we've weaseled our way into that have, we've seen them kind of planning on the fly things, in the upcoming weeks or months from something like the DNC, for example, or even before the sentencing of Azar in Portland. But realistically, it's good that there's not a shadow entity at the top, because that kind of coordination would be more, God forbid, kind of a 9/11 style series of threats, kind of like how Al-Qaeda and the Taliban operate. That's a very good thing. But it's bad because a guerrilla movement that is leaderless is very hard to decapitate. And
Yeah.
that's a totally different kind of danger. And I know we've chatted about this off the air before, but I don't know. They say every cloud has its silver lining, but man, sometimes it feels like every silver lining has its cloud.
Yes, it's extremely difficult to dismantle some of these movements, but not impossible. Last year, the Attorney General in the state of Georgia indicted 61 alleged Antifa associated people and charged them with domestic terrorism and RICO charges.
I was hoping that you would bring that up.
As far as I know, that's been the first time anywhere in the United States where RICO charges have been used for alleged members of a violent far left movement. That case is still ongoing. We'll see what happens at trial ultimately for these dozens of suspects.
Especially with how RICO might be being kind of looked at a federal and a Supreme Court level here in the next couple of years. But that's another topic for another time. I just can't help but mentioning.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing that up, though.
No, absolutely. Sorry for kind of a turn away from what we were originally chatting about. We don't get to chat as, perhaps as much as we'd like to, of course, but can't thank you enough for what it is that you do. Andy Ngo, you can find his stuff over at andy-ngo.com. You should be heading there if you haven't been watching it, scrolling past on the Chiron during this episode. And then, of course, check out Unmasked if you haven't yet. It may not be a brand new book, but it should be new to you. Andy, thanks so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you.